The Vietnam War, which spanned over 2 decades, began with seemingly good intentions but ultimately ended in tragedy for the Vietnamese people. It wasn't simply a war about communism, it was a profound fight for independence and sovereignty. However, a combination of American overconfidence, Cold War tensions, and imperialist tendencies turned this war into one of the darkest chapters in American history. By the war's end, the devastating toll was evident. Over 58,000 Americans had lost their lives, alongside 250,000 South Vietnamese soldiers. The toll on the Vietnamese people was even more catastrophic, with over 1 million North Vietnamese soldiers and Viet Cong guerrillas perishing, along with more than 2 million civilians from both the North and the South, and thousands more from Laos and Cambodia. To understand the roots of the Vietnam War, we need to go back to the late 19th century when the French began their conquest of Indochina. They boasted about bringing their civilization to Vietnam, constructing roads and bridges. However, the Vietnamese people resisted their French colonizers, just as they had resisted earlier invasions by the Chinese. The French were perceived as the enemy, and the struggle for independence ignited. In 1919, at the end of World War I, American President Woodrow Wilson visited Paris to shape a new world order and advocated for the independence of colonized nations. During his stay, a Vietnamese nationalist named Nguyen Ai Quoc presented a petition, signed by himself and others, requesting independence for Vietnam. Although the petition was promised to be shown to President Wilson, there is no evidence that it ever reached him. Ho Chi Minh's journey continued in exile for 3 decades. When he encountered the anti-colonial writings of Lenin, he became a communist with a burning desire for an independent Vietnam. By 1940, during World War II, as Germany conquered Western Europe and the Japanese occupied Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh returned to his homeland and founded the revolutionary movement known as the Vietnam Independence League, or the Viet Minh. This guerrilla force grew rapidly, employing hit-and-run guerrilla warfare tactics that would prove instrumental when facing the American forces later on. In the spring of 1945, 3 years after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States government was seeking ways to undermine Japanese forces in Vietnam. They established contact with Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh, supplying them with weapons and being impressed by their quick mastery of them. Ho Chi Minh even began referring to his followers as the Vietnamese Army and hailed the United States as a champion of democracy. As World War II drew to a close and Japanese surrenders seemed inevitable, Ho Chi Minh urged the Vietnamese people to seize control of their country before the French could return to re-establish their colonial rule. On September 2, 1945, the same day Japan surrendered, hundreds of thousands gathered in Ba Dinh Square in Hanoi to witness Ho Chi Minh proclaim Vietnam's independence. The future appeared promising. However, international geopolitics took a different turn. The Soviet Union had expanded its influence in Eastern Europe, and the Cold War was intensifying. The French, fearing the spread of communism, insisted that if their colonies gained independence with American assistance, they would fall under Soviet influence. This led to the French returning to Vietnam with American support in their bid to regain control. In 1950, with the outbreak of the Korean War and the United States pushing back North Korean invaders, the domino theory gained prominence. This theory postulated that if one nation fell to communism, others in the region would follow suit. The United States, concerned about the spread of communism in Asia, sent tens of thousands of troops to aid South Korea in repelling the invaders, demonstrating that communism in Asia could be contained. By 1953, the French, with American aid, had been locked in a 7-year struggle in Vietnam, resulting in over 100,000 casualties. French platoons faced relentless ambushes, blown-up trains, and blocked roads, only to be ambushed once more. The Viet Minh, supplied by the Soviets and Chinese, had proven themselves a formidable force. The French, demoralized and exhausted, sought to initiate talks to end the fighting. However, both sides attempted to bolster their military positions before negotiations. The French established a fortified base in Dien Bien Phu, convinced that any confrontation would guarantee their victory. Their confidence led them to underestimate the jungle-covered hills that loomed over their 11,000 men. The Viet Minh, consisting of 50,000 Vietnamese soldiers, surrounded the valley and relentlessly bombarded the French with heavy artillery. After 55 grueling days of this brutal siege, the French were left with no choice but to surrender. The toll was immense, with 8,000 troops lost. This victory for the Viet Minh instilled the belief that they could stand against a major Western power and emerge victorious. Following this defeat, an armistice was signed, dividing Vietnam along the 17th parallel and establishing a demilitarized zone. Civilians were granted 300 days to relocate to their preferred region, resulting in the migration of 900,000 refugees to the south, where the Republic of Vietnam was established. Saigon became its capital, and it was defended by the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. In contrast, the north, with its capital in Hanoi, was under Ho Chi Minh's leadership, where land reforms similar to those in Mao's China led to the loss of thousands of lives and mass imprisonments. However, the Viet Cong, an organization belonging to the National Liberation Front, was determined to break the peace and reunite Vietnam. The NLF's armed wing, known as the People's Liberation Army, was often derogatorily referred to by the U.S. and its allies as communist traitors. As John F. Kennedy took office, Cold War tensions reached new heights, and the fear of aggressive dictatorships spreading had policymakers on edge. The lesson from World War II was clear: aggressive dictatorships needed to be stopped before they posed a significant threat to global peace. Critics grew increasingly vocal about Kennedy's perceived leniency in the face of communism's expansion in Southeast Asia. While his advisors urged him to send ground troops into Vietnam to combat the Viet Cong, Kennedy opted to deploy an elite group of soldiers, the Green Berets, and military advisors. Their mission was to train and organize South Vietnam's military. Kennedy also escalated American involvement by doubling military funding, sending helicopters and armored personnel carriers, and authorizing the use of weapons like napalm, defoliants, and Agent Orange to deny cover to the Viet Cong and destroy their crops. Meanwhile, in North Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh anticipated an inevitable invasion by the South and was promised support by the Chinese. Conscription was introduced, mandating the service of every able-bodied man. In South Vietnam, corruption and the suppression of Buddhists by Catholic officials within the government of President Diem had reached intolerable levels. In a harrowing act of protest, a 73-year-old monk set himself on fire, immolating himself as a silent crowd bore witness. Tragically, more monks would follow suit, but instead of granting greater freedoms, President Diem imposed martial law and arrested anyone who protested against his regime. The situation in South Vietnam grew increasingly grim. What was promised to be a democracy had, in reality, become a dictatorship under President Diem. The discontent among South Vietnam's military generals, who had been assured that a coup would not be opposed by the United States, eventually led to the assassination of Diem and his brother. The news of their deaths sparked both celebration and anxiety among the populace. However, a new challenge loomed, one that President Kennedy had deeply feared. Who would replace Diem? Tragically, Kennedy did not live to see this question answered, as he was assassinated on November 22, 1963. His vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, now found himself at the helm of a nation deeply entangled in the complexities of Vietnam. Johnson, deeply concerned that any further intervention could exacerbate an already dire situation, had initially opposed the coup that ousted Diem. With the power vacuum in South Vietnam and growing internal turmoil, the Viet Cong seized the opportunity to intensify attacks throughout the countryside. A power struggle ensued in South Vietnam, marked by a series of rapidly changing governments. Between January 1964 and June 1965, the country witnessed the rise and fall of 8 different administrations, leaving a trail of political instability and ruin in its wake. Amid this chaos, the USS Maddox was dispatched to patrol the Gulf of Tonkin. It fired warning shots but came under fire from a North Vietnamese torpedo squadron. This incident took Ho Chi Minh by surprise, and he promptly removed the officer responsible for the hasty attack, citing impulsiveness. Ho Chi Minh sought answers and demanded to know who had authorized the attack. To this day, there are disagreements over the true source of that order. In Washington, the Joint Chiefs of Staff pressed for retaliation against North Vietnam. However, Johnson remained cautious and refused to take immediate action. He argued that a second attack was necessary to justify retaliation. This second attack never materialized. Instead, American sonar operators convinced themselves that a North Vietnamese attack had likely occurred, although it remained uncertain. Johnson was informed that the attack was probable but not certain. Since it was likely to have occurred, he was advised that it should not go unanswered. American pilots were then sent to attack North Vietnamese torpedo boat installations and oil facilities. This marked the first time American pilots dropped bombs on Vietnam. The pretext of a second attack, which never transpired, allowed Congress to pass the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. This resolution granted the president the authority to assist any Southeast Asian country threatened by communist aggression. It provided Johnson with the legal justification to deploy U.S. forces in Vietnam as a retaliatory measure. The Viet Cong escalated their attacks, launching a barrage of rockets that struck an American airbase near Saigon, resulting in the deaths of 5 Americans and the destruction of 5 B-57 bombers. Johnson's advisors once again recommended sending ground troops and conducting air attacks in the north, but he remained resistant to committing troops on the ground. In a further provocation, the Viet Cong attacked an American helicopter base in Pleiku, killing 8 advisors and hundreds of South Vietnamese. Additionally, they bombed a hotel, claiming the lives of 23 Americans. In response, Johnson initiated Operation Rolling Thunder on March 2, 1965, systematically bombing targets in North Vietnam. The president had shifted his policy from retaliatory bombing to an all-out offensive, a decision kept concealed from the American public. The widening of the war was not disclosed to the people, as it was feared that revealing this dramatic change could be met with public backlash. As Viet Cong attacks persisted, the United States found itself deeply committed to the conflict, unable to withdraw without appearing weak and leaving behind a chaotic and unstable South Vietnam. In March 1965, President Johnson made a decision he had long avoided, sending ground troops into Vietnam. Contrary to the official narrative, which depicted the conflict as a fight against communism, the Pentagon Papers later revealed that this move aimed to avoid humiliation. As 1966 began, the toll was grim. 2,344 Americans had lost their lives in Vietnam, and 200,000 troops were stationed there, with more reinforcements on the way. The Viet Cong now controlled 3/4 of South Vietnam's countryside, efficiently moving their supplies and weapons along a complex network of jungle roadways spanning 12,000 miles, infamously known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The American strategy reasoned that if this trail could be significantly damaged, the enemy would struggle to sustain itself. In pursuit of this goal, an astonishing 3 million tons of explosives were dropped on the Laos portion of the trail alone, exceeding the amount dropped on Germany and Japan combined during World War II. Months turned into years, and as the death toll among American troops continued to climb, a narrative emerged that attempted to reassure the American people. They were told that they were killing the enemy at a favorable ratio of 10-1. However, what truly mattered to American families were the lives of their loved ones, not statistics. General Westmoreland, who asserted that he could win the war within 3 years, urgently requested $200,000 for reinforcements. In response, Secretary of Defense McNamara presented President Johnson with 2 options: negotiate a compromise with Hanoi or send more troops. McNamara's grim assessment of the war's winnability, a 1 in 3 chance, did not bode well for the prospects of victory. However, Johnson chose the second option, to send more men. Even though many in Washington were aware of the war's futility, hundreds of thousands of American troops were being readied for deployment to a conflict they knew was a lost cause. The struggle in Vietnam was not solely against the Vietnamese people. It was also a battle against the unforgiving terrain. American soldiers had to navigate through dense elephant grass, thorn bushes, towering bamboo, and jungles so thick that progress was agonizingly slow, an hour to move a mere 100 feet. The soldiers faced relentless challenges, including finger-length black leeches that inflicted wounds prone to infection, while sunlight rarely penetrated the jungle floor. In addition to the inhospitable environment, soldiers grappled with M16 rifles prone to jamming in gunfights, often costing lives at critical moments. Although American forces rarely lost battles, victories seemed irrelevant. Enemy soldiers could be swiftly replaced, and U.S. troops were stretched thin, causing the recapture of previously held territory by the enemy. By the close of 1967, the death toll had reached a staggering 20,000 Americans. Back home, the American public was told that victory was on the horizon, a light at the end of the tunnel. However, the reality on the ground told a different story, and the protests against the war intensified as 1968 dawned. By this point in the conflict, over 500,000 U.S. troops were stationed in Vietnam, and American leaders were assuring the public that victory was within reach. However, unbeknownst to the American public, the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong were meticulously planning a large-scale offensive known as the Tet Offensive. This operation involved a series of coordinated attacks on South Vietnamese towns and cities, with the ultimate goal of capturing Saigon, which, if achieved, would force the Americans into withdrawal. The chosen date for this ambitious assault was January 31st, coinciding with the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, known as Tet. Ho Chi Minh, the North Vietnamese leader, rallied his troops with the promise of total victory, advance, and we will achieve total victory. In preparation for Tet, a 36-hour truce was declared, and thousands of South Vietnamese troops returned home to celebrate the holiday. On January 30th, the Tet Offensive commenced, with 84,000 Viet Cong guerrillas and North Vietnamese soldiers launching attacks on 36 out of South Vietnam's 44 provincial capitals. They targeted numerous American and South Vietnamese military bases, as well as the country's 6 largest cities, including Hue, Da Nang, and Saigon. However, as the intense fighting unfolded, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces encountered unexpected resistance. South Vietnamese soldiers and U.S. troops inflicted significant casualties on the attackers. This pattern of heavy losses for the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong continued throughout the battle. For the first time, U.S. soldiers were engaging the enemy directly in urban areas, where the Viet Cong had historically thrived on guerrilla warfare tactics. Despite the initial shock of the Tet Offensive, U.S. officials, including President Johnson, declared it a resounding victory for the United States and the South Vietnamese Army. Of the 84,000 enemy troops who participated in the Tet Offensive, 58,000 were killed, wounded, or captured. The Vietnam War marked the first television war, with live coverage from the front lines broadcast directly into American living rooms. Up to the Tet Offensive, the American public had been consistently told that victory was imminent, and the North Vietnamese were on the brink of defeat. When the offensive was launched, it contradicted these assurances, eroding public trust in the government's handling of the war. As a result, anti-war protests erupted across the country. On March 31, 1968, President Johnson addressed the nation on television. He announced that the U.S. would halt its bombing campaign in North Vietnam in an attempt to bring the North Vietnamese to the negotiating table. In a stunning turn of events, he also revealed that he would not seek re-election. These announcements left the nation in a state of shock and confusion. Johnson aimed to redirect his efforts toward achieving peace, but the country remained deeply divided. Tragically, in the midst of this turmoil, civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, further fueling protests and unrest. The United States hadn't witnessed such divisions since the Civil War. Adding to the nation's turmoil, Robert Kennedy, who had campaigned on a promise to end the war, was also assassinated in June, leaving the country grappling with profound grief and division. When Richard Nixon assumed the presidency, he ran on a platform of ending the war in Vietnam and healing a deeply divided nation. By the time he took office, nearly 37,000 U.S. troops had lost their lives, and the war had become a central issue in the minds of Americans. However, the covert tactics Nixon employed to secure his position as the nation's leader remained hidden from the public. As the next presidential election approached, President Lyndon B. Johnson was making substantial progress toward ending the war. He had agreed to halt all bombing campaigns in North Vietnam, and for the first time, Hanoi had consented to engage in peace talks with Saigon and include the Viet Cong in the negotiations. It seemed that peace, for the first time in a long while, was on the horizon. However, on November 2nd, just 3 days before the U.S. election, South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu unexpectedly withdrew from the peace talks. Unbeknownst to the American public, representatives from the Nixon campaign had secretly contacted the Saigon government, urging them to stay away from the negotiations. They promised that once Nixon was elected president, he would adopt a tougher stance in negotiations with Hanoi compared to his opponent, Hubert Humphrey. Johnson, who had uncovered these secret dealings through a CIA informant and FBI wiretaps on the South Vietnamese embassy in Washington, found himself facing a crisis of monumental proportions. He had learned that Nixon and his team had engaged in what could be considered treason, contacts with a foreign power in the midst of a war. Despite this knowledge, Johnson chose to keep this information to himself, unwilling to reveal the source of his intelligence. As the peace talks reached an impasse, the war dragged on, and American troops continued to be sent into battle, with many losing their lives in seemingly pointless engagements. Battles were fought for territories like Hamburger Hill, only for them to be abandoned shortly afterward. The emphasis was on body counts, a metric that obscured the futility of the fighting. Back home, protests against the war persisted, fueled by the public's growing disillusionment. Thousands of American soldiers were dying in battles that seemed to have no clear purpose. Nixon recognized the need for a change in policy, as anti-war sentiment had become overwhelming. Nixon's new strategy was called Vietnamization. It involved gradually transferring more responsibilities to the South Vietnamese army while bringing American troops back home. The U.S. began training ARVN forces and provided them with a substantial arsenal, including over 1 million M16 rifles, 40,000 grenade launchers, and numerous vehicles. Both American and South Vietnamese leaders understood that if the United States couldn't win with 500,000 troops, South Vietnam stood little chance on its own. Publicly, Nixon presented Vietnamization as a success. On September 2, 1969, the 24th anniversary of Ho Chi Minh's declaration of Vietnam's independence, the revered leader passed away. Despite military victories and a decrease in casualty figures, anti-war sentiment continued to grow. The revelation of a massacre in the village of My Lai, where American soldiers had killed over 500 innocent men, women, and children, further fueled protests and opposition to the war. The anti-war movement reached its zenith when hundreds of thousands of people across the country took to the streets. Tragedy struck as 4 students were killed at Kent State University, and 2 more lost their lives at Jackson State University during protests. With negotiations at an impasse, Nixon initiated a bombing campaign around Hanoi, famously known as the Christmas bombing. On December 26, 1969, this campaign resulted in the deaths of 1,600 civilians. Hanoi, under the pressure of the relentless bombings, agreed to return to the negotiating table. Remarkably, it took just 6 days to reach a final agreement. On March 29, 1973, the last American troops departed from South Vietnam, leaving only a small contingent of 200 Marines to help guard the American embassy and other facilities in Saigon. Diplomats and CIA agents also remained. Although American forces were leaving, the conflict persisted, with both North and South Vietnam still embroiled in a brutal civil war. The civilian population found themselves once again trapped in the midst of the conflict. Nixon had assured South Vietnam that the U.S. Air Force would provide assistance if Saigon faced trouble, as they had done during the Easter Offensive. However, by August 1974, Nixon had resigned amid the Watergate scandal, and Congress was in no mood to provide further aid. They drastically reduced funding and support for South Vietnam, and up to 20,000 ARVN troops were leaving the military each month. The U.S. had provided guns, but not enough ammunition, planes, but no pilots or training, and trucks, but no spare parts. The situation in the South deteriorated rapidly. The North Vietnamese forces relentlessly pushed southward, defeating ARVN troops at every turn. After 30 years of civil war, it became clear that Saigon was on the verge of falling, and the inevitable was about to happen. Soldiers and civilians began fleeing south to escape the advancing North Vietnamese army, and President Nguyen Van Thieu resigned. On April 29, 1975, the invasion of Saigon commenced, marking the beginning of the evacuation. Helicopters played a crucial role, picking up groups of people and ferrying them to aircraft carriers and ships. Once these vessels were full, helicopters were pushed into the ocean to prevent more people from coming and to ensure the safe evacuation of those on board. As the situation grew increasingly dire, South Vietnam surrendered to halt further bloodshed. Many South Vietnamese were sent to re-education camps, where they faced imprisonment for extended periods, sometimes up to 10 years. ARVN graveyards were bulldozed or locked, and every effort was made to erase the memory of the South Vietnamese regime. After 3 decades of civil conflict, Saigon fell, and Vietnam was united under a single communist nation. The Soviet Union provided support, and Vietnam embarked on a new socialist path. Agriculture was collectivized, capitalism was abolished, and industry was nationalized, all under strict communist control. However, the economic consequences were dire, leading to a significant decline in the standard of living, food shortages, and starvation. In the aftermath, 1.5 million people fled Vietnam, with 400,000 making it to the United States. In the words of John Kerry, the Vietnam War raised profound questions about morality, rationalization, America's values in the face of events like the My Lai massacre, and the human cost of political decisions. It was a war that left a lasting impact on both America and Vietnam, challenging conventional thinking and reshaping the course of history. Amid the politics and policies, the bravery and sacrifices of those who fought and died on all sides should never be forgotten. The war was not merely a soldiers' conflict, but a political one, and its legacy endures for both nations.